Welcome and thank you for tuning in. You're listening to the Beyond 50 radio program. I'm Daniel Davis. On the program today, we're doing part 2 of a 2-part series on interpreting waking dreams. Last time we were joined with David Rivetus, who would explain how our daytime experiences is being just like the nighttime dream, how we can look at startling, disturbing, and repetitive events of our days, which are also like dreams and can be interpreted exactly like the conventional dreams of our sleep. We'll also talk about the simple 5-step method technique that he's created, which you can use to get more insight into the meaning of your dreams. His website is teacherofdreams.com, and his book, Always Be Dreaming. I'd like to welcome to the Beyond 50 radio program today our guest, David Rivetus. David, thank you for joining us again here on the program today.
It's really a pleasure to be back, Daniel. Thanks for having me.
You bet. Now let's talk about how you go about analyzing a dream.
Okay, well, I think the first thing that we should probably reiterate is that dreams come in 2 forms. There's the typical kind that we all think of as dreams, where we're lying asleep and in the morning we wake up, and there are sometimes bizarre images that we have remembered from the nighttime and our sleep. And then the part that you were talking about, which is the concept which is probably new to everyone, that actually this process goes on when we're awake too. And as you said, the startling or the unusual or the repetitive experiences we have in life can be interpreted exactly as if they were the same as a dream we had when we were asleep. So that rather expands the arena in which we can work on dreams through metaphor, which is how I work with dreams. My understanding from, and my experience, I should say, from, really now almost 4 decades of working in this field, is that life is constantly speaking to us in a language that we are not used to speaking or hearing, and that is the language of metaphor. We all know about dream symbols. Dream symbols come to us, well, what does that symbol mean? Well, actually what it is a metaphor for something. An example would be if you have a dream symbol of a house, let's say a house. Well, what's a house metaphorically? Well, it's where you live. And that can be where you live physically, for sure, but it can also be where you live in your consciousness or in your thoughts or in your spirituality or in your anger. And so if you have a dream that is about a house and say that house is burning down, that's a more pleasant dream. Even though it's not very pleasant, it's still more pleasant if it's happening at night when you're asleep, because then you can wake up in the morning and say, oh, whew, gosh, I thought that was really happening. But it's also the same experience if you are wide awake and you have been out running errands and you try to pull into your driveway and you see that the roof is caught on fire on your house. That is an even more poignant set of metaphors about something that is being either cleansed or removed or renewed from your own state of where you live, in your mind or in your body. And those would be the specifics of what we would want to try to work out when we work together on a dream.
Mm-hmm. Now, when it comes to dreams and dream symbols, as you were talking about, how do you work with those?
You know, one of my favorite techniques. Okay, well, let me back up a second. What I try to do with the dreamer is to get the dreamer to give me the most essential, most basic meaning of a symbol. Now, let's say they have a dream with a symbol with water in it, and I usually start with a very neutral question, which is, tell me about water. Now, some people will get right to the core of what water means to them. They might say something like, well, boy, without water I couldn't live. It's what gives us life and allows us to continue in this existence. But other people are sometimes so engaged in the dream that they will give me an answer that is more about their own attitudes about water. They might say, "Oh, well, I just love swimming," or "Boy, I almost drowned once, and boy, I don't like to go near water. I don't swim very well." Or they might say something like, "Well, lived in a desert community, and water was always something of particular precious value." Now, all of these answers have a peripheral importance, but they are not quite at the core. And so when I get an answer like that, then what I try to do is I try to separate the individual from their own emotional, let's say, attitude toward the symbol. And that is that I tell them that I'm from Mars. Or I tell them that I'm a very small child. But the one from Mars usually works quite well. I say, I'm from Mars and I have no understanding at all of the things that you have here on Earth. Please tell me about water and say it in a way that I can understand. Well, that obliges the dreamer to then try to cut to the absolute core of what water is, or whatever the symbol would be that they're talking about. And usually they come up with exactly what the metaphor is when that's done. Instead of saying, "Oh, well, I just love water because, I used to live by the ocean," they would say, "Well, water is one of the most important things in our lives. It's what keeps us alive because we are actually physically almost entirely made up of water." So suddenly, by pretending to be a Martian, I cut to the core of the dream's metaphoric meaning, and that's a really good beginning.
Now, when it comes to using those symbols, now what would you say is the trickiest part of the process? It sounds like you touched on it there a little bit.
Yeah, well, there are a few tricky moments. The first one is getting the dreamer to understand what it is that we're after, which is, again, this absolute most basic meaning of the dream symbol. But then the second part, which is even more difficult, especially if the dreamer is emotionally involved, emotionally invested in the dream, is to get the dreamer to understand that every single facet of a dream is about the dreamer. Now, let me give an example of how this can wreak a little bit of temporary havoc in a dreamer's life. A really common kind of dream that happens. Let's talk about a nighttime dream for the moment. Let's say the husband wakes up and he is just livid with his wife because in his dream last night, the wife said some really nasty things to him, and he was just beside himself that they were uncalled for and they were untrue, and why would she do that kind of thing? And he's worked himself up into a complete tizzy over this issue. And when someone comes to me like that, then the first thing maybe not the first thing, but at some point I very gradually try to impress upon this individual is that even though that came in the image of his wife, and even though that image of his wife was saying some things that were uncalled for in the dream, the fact is it was him. And to get the dreamer to own the symbol, that there was some facet of his feminine self, his closest feminine self, that was trying to deliver a message to him about maybe some things that weren't really so far off base, that he needed to look at within himself. Now that's a pretty hefty horse pill to swallow for most of us. Most of us don't like to hear that when we feel as if we have been abused and maligned, actually the person who was doing the abusing and the maligning was ourself. So that is, in fact, one of the big hurdles that has to be overcome when dealing with dreams. And again, it's a little easier if it's a sleeping dream, what I call a sleeping dream, one that you had when you were asleep. But if the conflict is a real conflict between a husband and wife that's going on in the daytime, and they're ready to go see a marriage and family counselor over an unresolved issue, the difference between what a family marriage counselor and I would do might be that the family and marriage counselor would sit there and try to set up a series of negotiations between them to see if they could find some common ground on which to reevaluate and then recommit to a relationship with better principles to live by. Mm-hmm. Now that's a really valid thing to do, but I go even a step further and I say, wait a minute, if you're having this conflict, this is an expression metaphorically of who you are at this moment. And that conflict would not be there if you were not experiencing the conflict within yourself. And not only that, there are two ways to try to resolve this. You can do it in the way that a family and marriage counselor would do it, which would be to try to negotiate your way through to a common ground. But if you work on this issue by yourself and understand the message that this waking dream is trying to tell you, and resolve it within yourself, you will be flabbergasted to see what happens with your relationship with your partner, because that will be resolved without you ever confronting your partner. Mm-hmm. That's a really radical concept for people.
Now, there's a really interesting example you give in your book about that. There was a couple who the wife was fearful of the fact that there might be some adultery or cheating going on there because of the kinds of dreams that he was having in regards to, well, eventually we unraveled what that was. Tell our listeners a little bit about that dream.
Sure. That was, in retrospect, some of these dreams are quite entertaining. At the time, certainly the participants don't feel very entertained by them because they feel as if something terrible is happening. But this was a case in which the husband was having dreams that he had a mistress. And he quite innocently told his wife about this dream. Boy, I had this dream, but this dream kept coming back. And his wife started to get rather suspicious and very concerned that there was some extramarital activity going on, and she worked herself up into somewhat of a state over this, and it didn't matter how many times he tried to convince her that there was really nothing going on. Mm-hmm. She was having a hard time with this, but they had a friend who knew me, and so they were referred to me about this dream. And again, one of the very two things that I was working on to begin with. One was the understanding that the mistress was not to be taken literally. The mistress was a symbol. It was a metaphor for something that was going on. And then the second thing was that it was something that was going on in the husband's life within his own life, and that it really didn't have anything to do with him cheating on his wife. And so the first thing we did was I asked him the same question. Well, tell me about. Well, I think he used the term girlfriend. I don't think he used the term mistress. But I said, so tell me about girlfriends. And what came out was so revealing, because it wasn't anything that you would expect it to be. He said, well, actually, I think having an extramarital affair with a girlfriend would be really a pain in the butt. And that's not quite what you would think of as having, as being an answer from a guy, certainly, about maybe having an illicit affair. And so we delved into that concept a little bit deeper, and he kept saying things like, well, you'd just be running around hiding stuff, and you'd be trying to keep, handling two relationships at the same time and trying to keep them from each other, and it would just be a major ordeal and a hassle. And so from that, then we went to the next step, which was to try to discover what it was within himself, understanding that this dream symbol was an expression of something, of a conflict that was going on within himself. And we looked and we delved a little deeper. What is it in your life right now that feels as if you are having a relationship with some facet of yourself that you're having to keep it, you're having to juggle this thing, and it's uncomfortable, and it's taking your energy away, all the descriptions he gave of what it would be like to have a mistress. And it was actually his wife who came up with the answer. And it was that he was a woodworker, and he restored antiques. And he had been working on this antique that was driving him crazy because, as is the case often with antique restorers, you think it's going to be a simple job, and then you get in and you discover, well, you weren't the first one to get there, and all of a sudden you're having to undo somebody else's work, and it goes on, and you've given a bid for this job, and it's been accepted, and now you discover that actually you're losing money on the job.
Mm-hmm.
And so it became that this mistress, this thing that, I remember what he said. He said, a mistress is somebody who looks and appears beautiful to begin with, but it's all downhill from there.
Right.
Those were his words. And that was exactly what was going on with this piece of furniture that he was restoring. That it looked so beautiful, and it was an antique, and it was a time period that he was particularly attracted to, and all of a sudden this job that ought to have been so wonderful ended up being misery and a chain around his neck, as he put it, and very difficult. And so what evolved out of this was, first of all, we got rid of the idea that there was sexual cheating going on and that there was an illicit romance, and so his wife could relax. So she relaxed. She was the first one to relax. And then we started working on the issue of, well, how could he renegotiate this contract with the owners of this piece of furniture so that this would be not so much a chain around his neck, not so much downhill from there, in his own words, so that he could work on it with pleasure rather than with this sense of a burden.
Mm-hmm.
And it was a revelation to them.
What was really interesting about that, too, is it was actually the wife who came up with the solution to the situation. She says it's the armoire.
That's right. Yeah, that's right. There was an armoire. That's right. And somebody pointed out, I talked about this once to someone who had read the book, and she said, well, armoire is associated with the word somehow with romance, and I forgot how that fit. But in another language, there was an association between the word armoire and the word love affair or romance, which I thought was I hadn't even picked that up, but I thought that was interesting. But yes, she was the one who came up with the answer. Once she felt that she was off the hot seat, and once she began to understand that this really didn't have anything to do with what her worst fears were, then she really got into the act. She began to explore this, and she was the one who then came up with the understanding that this was about a conflict that he was having at work, and how he was going to deal with this at work.
Mm-hmm.
Now that came from a sleeping dream. I can give you, if you're interested, an example that I recently dealt with of a waking dream that was in its own way just as poignant. I don't know if
Yeah, please do,
okay.
Because what I wanted you to do was, first of all, on our program last time, we recapped what exactly constitutes the significance of a waking dream. What are the conditions that need to be for a waking dream to be a waking dream? And then we'll go into the 5-step technique that you use to get more insight into dreams. But first of all, what conditions have to exist for a waking dream to be a waking dream?
Well, everything we experience in our waking lives is a waking dream.
Okay.
The real question is what makes it important.
Mm-hmm.
And I think the bottom line thing to say is, if you have an experience that doesn't leave you alone, that you sit there and you grouse about it, or you ponder it, or somehow it won't go away of its own accord. Maybe it was a silly incident that happened, and yet you find yourself running it again and again like a tape in your head. Those are the ones to pay attention to. And usually they happen as a result of one of three experiences. Now, one of them would be an experience where it's a shock. And one of the ones I relate in my book was about a young man who thought he was being attacked by some Doberman pinschers. And he was just out for a stroll, and these two Dobermans came running straight at him. And he turned white as a sheet and just about passed out there. And it turned out the dogs were completely friendly. They were just running up to him to say hello. But it's pretty intimidating when you see two police dogs come running straight at you. And he was shaken by that. For days after that, he was still shaking over that experience. So that's a shock. That's one kind, and one that's very common along those lines are people who have near misses or fender benders in traffic, and those are the kinds of things that stay with you for a long time. That's a shocking dream. Now the next kind is a bizarre dream, and we've been on the subject of romance, so I'll tell a story on myself, which was as a young man I was trying to prepare a dinner for a lady in whom I was interested, and I was a French dish that involved a chicken, and I had bought chicken from the same place for years and years and years, and had never had a problem with buying chickens from them. And on this particular evening, the chicken that I prepared, the sauce, now think about this metaphorically. The sauce that I prepared for this meal was absolutely delicious. The meat was so tough, you almost couldn't cut it with a knife. Now, that had never happened to me before, and it has never happened to me since. And I'm of retirement age, just like all your listeners. And that was an unusual, bizarre experience that was giving me a very important message about the compatibility of this particular relationship. That the sauce was terrific, but the meat was unpalatable. And if we had really known that we were in the middle of a dream, the two of us could have saved ourselves a lot of hardship and subsequent ordeal of getting deeper into this relationship and then trying to extricate ourselves from what was clearly not working.
Right.
But that's how the dream works. And let me just add something here. Let's see. It's just slipped my mind. What was I going to say? That a lot of people say to me when they hear about the waking dream, well, you're just projecting your own attitudes onto some experience that you've had. And my answer to them is that how did I project my experience onto a piece of chicken?
Right.
That I have never had an equivalent experience with a piece like that, a piece of chicken, before or since. That appeared into my life as if by magic. And I've long stopped thinking that this kind of thing is magic because I've seen it so consistently. It's a principle. It's a law of the universe that these things come into our lives seemingly uninvited, often in upsetting fashion, and they plunk themselves right in the middle. I mean, this was a candlelight dinner.
Right.
It was supposed to be romantic, and here we are sitting there sawing away at this chicken that wouldn't allow itself to be cut. That's the kind of thing that happens to us with far more frequency than we really understand and realize. It's somehow we conspire right along with the universe to give ourselves messages. And if we would only pay attention to them in the moment, and again, look at them metaphorically, this was not about getting sharper knives. This was an experience that was delivering, actually, both of us, a message that said, you guys, if you understand that you're dreaming right now, even though you're wide awake, that you are in the middle of a dream, you will save yourselves a lot of subsequent hardship. Fortunately, like most people who have these experiences, we were not aware enough of the process to deal with it in a way that would have saved us some trouble.
You know, here's a funny one. It's more lighthearted more than anything else, but you think about, for instance, people out there who are trying to work in the arena of self-improvement. Of course, one of the areas they'd like to see improvement in always tends to be money. And, you know, so there was an exercise basically where you have gratitude for whatever comes into your life. And so I was applying that and realizing there was something I had read, some obscure thing in a book some years ago about that you're given opportunities, you're pretty much given what you want, but you need to pay attention to it quite a bit. And one of them was something about picking up a penny off the street. You know, pick up a penny and you'll have good luck, that sort of a thing. So what I'd do is I'd see a penny and I'd pick it up and I'd, you know, thank you for the, you know, the abundance or whatever the case is, and put it in my pocket. And then over time I would notice that I was finding sometimes 2 or 3 pennies at a time. And then eventually it started growing to where then I started finding nickels and not pennies anymore. Then eventually it started getting to a point where I was finding dimes and not nickels or pennies anymore. And then eventually quarters. And I just found that interesting that it kept growing that way.
And Daniel, here's why I think it kept growing. This would be my take on it if this dream were mine.
Right.
Which is that as you were working on your self-worth and your understanding of yourself as being worthwhile, then the expression from the universe was showing you that, yes, in fact, you are growing in your own estimation of your self-worth.
Mm-hmm.
So that, yes, it started off as pennies, but, you know, keep it up. Maybe it's going to be $500 bills if you keep going. Or in some way, the expression of your own self. I was going to use the word self-importance, but I don't mean it in an egotistical way.
No, not at all, of course.
I mean it just in the sense that you understand, as we all need to understand, that we are of God and we are of soul. And once we do, we understand that we are incredibly worthwhile. And the universe, I think, was in a very beautiful and slightly humorous way expressing that to you. Mm-hmm. Yes, you are worth more than you think. Every day you go out, you're going to discover that you're worth more than you were yesterday.
Right. Now, okay, so we have shocking, we have bizarre, and then there was one more.
Right, okay, and that's repetitive. When you have, oh boy, I just did one recently that was shocking and repetitive. And that was that I had a client referred to me who told me that there were 5 instances in this individual's life where someone close to them had either died or been completely incapacitated by brain tumors. Inoperable brain tumors, or one time they tried to operate. There was a father, then there was, I think, a brother-in-law, and then there was a best friend, and then there was another relative, and then ultimately this individual's cat ended up with a brain tumor and died. And so this individual came to me, you know, in some horror and in some fear about what this was all about, and were they going to get a brain tumor. And again, what we did was we went through the steps. You know, the first step, tell me about brain tumors. And I should say that all of the individuals in this case were males, including the cat. Every single one was a male. And so, tell me about brain tumors. Well, there's something that grows in your ability, that affects your ability to reason. And by the way, I am paraphrasing what this particular dreamer said, not everybody would come up with these answers, which is why dreams are such individual experiences. But in this particular case, the dreamer said, well, they are something that grows in the area where you make your decisions and you think, and you, I believe this dreamer said, hold your spirituality even. And they affect your cognizance, and they affect your ability to interact with the world, and they affect your ability to function. And so then we dealt with the whole dream symbol of all of these being males. And tell me about males. In this case, I didn't. Well, no, I guess I did use the Martian a few times, but this individual caught on really quickly, and said, "Well, the male that's the one that's the manifester, the female energy." And we weren't talking about men and women here. We were talking about energies that are within each of us, no matter what gender we are. But the male is the builder, the manifester. When it's working right, it's the manifester. When it's not working right, it's aggressive and it tears things down. But when it's functional and functioning well, it's the manifester, it's the builder, as opposed to the feminine, which is the intuitive and the dreamer. And so then the question was, what is it in your life, given these two dream symbols now, that is causing your own ability to manifest, your own ability to be a creator, a builder of whatever it is that is your passion in life, that is causing this to be debilitated to the extreme that it's dying, that it is no longer able to function, and that it is causing tremendous disability within your own arena of work and life and creativity. And this came as a real shock to this individual. And at first, there was a little bit of denial in that they couldn't identify with it. And as the session progressed, it became clearer and clearer that there was indeed something going on that was a huge encumbrance on this individual, and that it was destroying them, not in the sense of a brain tumor really, but in their own self-esteem and their own ability to work. So that's a profound example. Fortunately, they're usually not quite as poignant as that one was, but that's an example of a repetitive dream symbol that is very powerful. A more typical one might be that, let's say you have a computer that's not working right, and so you call in at great expense your computer specialist, and he does a lot of great things and puts your computer back together, and it works for a day, and then all of a sudden the same symptom comes back. You have to call him in again, and maybe 3 or 4 times. Well, at that point, then I would say it's time to look at the dream of that. That's really not about your computer. That's about your own internal computer and something that's not functioning there. And we would go, tell me about computers. So, if you want, one thing I can do is take a single symbol and then go through the 5 steps, if that would.
Yes, please do.
Okay. All right. So I'm going to. I've actually dealt with two of the steps. The one about the tell me about it part, and then the part about owning it. But if you go from the beginning to the end of the process, there are actually 5 steps. And the first one is really simple. The dreamer just relates the dream. Very, very simple. They tell you what happened. And let me give you an example. So this was one that I worked on a few months ago. You may remember that last winter, things, especially in the Northeast or in the northern part of the country, got very cold, and there was just tons of snow. And this was an individual who, by the way, is a professional artist who lives in Vermont. And so as spring was starting to emerge in Vermont, there were signs of spring, but there was still tons of snow on the ground. And this individual lives in a rural area, and she has picture windows which look out over this lovely meadow. And as unfortunately too often happens in a situation like that. Birds tend not to see the glass, and they come flying into it. And early in spring, with still lots of snow on the ground, a male cardinal flew into the window and hit it so hard that it killed this bird. So this bird landed with a plop on all of this snow. Now you can just imagine the image of this brilliant red against this background for miles around of nothing but white. And this made, again, a powerful impression on this dreamer, plus the fact that she loves animals. I mean, the last thing she would want to do would be to harm, especially a bird. So there's step number one. She simply told me what happened. Okay, so step number two was the tell me about it part. And I'm going to simplify this a little bit simply because this ended up being such a powerful and such a varied symbol. I will just run through all the ones, and we worked on this over a period of weeks. This wasn't just one session. The obvious things, well, there are several obvious things, but one was, the cardinal. A cardinal is an official of the church. And of the Catholic Church. And I said, well, tell me about the Catholic Church. And she said, well, for her, it stood for orthodoxy. So there was something about an officialdom and orthodoxy that got stopped in its tracks, as it were, and killed outright. And that was already a powerful symbol. Another one was the cardinal directions. That was another symbol, and it tied right into this. What if orthodoxy is being brought to a dead standstill, literally a dead standstill? What direction do you see yourself going in? Then there was another one. The St. Louis Cardinals, that came up in the discussion. Okay, well, they play games. Well, tell me about the game they play. Well, it really is just a game, and there really is nothing particularly substantive about what they're doing in terms of improving life or in terms of bringing something great to the world. This is just a pastime. So that, too, was an element of this dream, the idea of playing games. And then there was another, of course, then the symbol of the brilliant red, and she being an artist. So she tied it into her sense of it being an artist. And then the last symbol that came out of it, she decided to look up in a dictionary and find out where the word cardinal came from. And strange as it may seem, its Latin roots come from the word hinge, like a door hinge. And so this idea, again, that this was brought into her life as a point, a hinge, a place where there might be a change in direction or a movement in a different direction. So that was step number two. Tell me about it. Then step number three came along. So step number two is interpret the symbols as metaphors. Step number three, retell the dream using, and here is this all-important part, owning the metaphors. These were all a description of herself. And what I'm just going to paraphrase again here, but the idea was that I often say there is a part of me when I retell the dream and I try to use the words of the dreamer as much as I can. There is a part of me that is flying along in its most orthodox manner, and it hits an invisible barrier where all of a sudden other aspects of myself come into play. One of them is the idea that there's a game being played. Another one is that there is a choice of direction. And another one is that wherever I go is going to hinge on some decision that I have to make. Now, isn't that amazing that came from, all of that came from the simple act, unfortunately a tragic act, of a bird hitting a window.
Hmm.
And it was delivering this powerful message. So then the next step is find, let's see, what have we gone through? We've gone through, retell the dream, retell the dream using and owning the metaphors. And then there's another step in there. I can't think what it is, but then the final step is that you go through and you discuss what the dream's relevance is in your life. And so we said, is there something going on in your life right now where you are considering a change in direction? And it may have something to do with your art. That was the symbol of the red. And maybe somebody else might have come up with seeing red. There may have been some anger involved. This particular dreamer didn't bring that up. But what emerged was this story in her life all about how she's at the moment of retirement. And there are things in her life that need to be addressed if she knows, in order for her to decide what direction she goes in her retirement. And some of it has to do with this art. But how is she going to express this art? Is she going to do it in an orthodox fashion, where she had been, teaching classes and having people in, or does she want to go off in a different direction, hinge herself off in a different direction, like a compass needle, and maybe do something that is completely creative and doesn't involve all of these shoulds? That's what she identified as being the orthodox part of this. And was she in fact playing games? Was she playing games with herself where she was trying to be really orthodox when in fact what she really wanted to do was to go off, as many artists do, in a really creative and unusual and unorthodox direction?
Ah.
And she found this cause for real thought. And it's one that she struggled with for a long time before she came to a conclusion about it.
Mm-hmm.
So that's I somewhere in there I put two of the symbols together, and I can't remember which two they are. Let's see. Relate the dream. You relate the dream. You analyze the symbols. I know what I did. Okay. You relate the dream. Then the second step is you isolate the symbols.
Right.
Okay. So you have to figure out what the symbols are that are important, and that was obvious in the cases that I gave. Then you go through and you restate the dream, retell the dream using and owning the metaphors. And then ultimately you discuss the dream's importance in the dreamer's life. That's the method.
And it's pretty fascinating to take a look at this, because it's rare that you see anything out there that can actually help people along in their lives, whether it's trying to improve an aspect or their whole selves, or they're actually looking for guidance or, ways that can move them in directions they would like to go. And it's pretty fascinating, as you were saying earlier in the program, that life tells us, life teaches us, life shows us, if this is really what you want, then this is the way you go about it. But, again, we can pass that off, that was kind of strange, but then you move in a different direction rather than paying attention to that signpost that's right there in front of you.
I think one of the best cases to illustrate exactly what you were talking about, Daniel, is your own example of finding the money.
Mm-hmm.
People come to me usually when they're in some crisis. They've had a dream and it has really upset them, whether it's a sleeping dream or a waking dream. They are upset to the point where they need some intervention and some help. Well, that's the dream when it's finally pounding the door down, trying to get us, and I include myself, believe me, to pay attention to the messages that are being delivered. What was so beautiful and so wonderful about the dream experience you had with finding all the change on the street is the fact that the universe is just as happy to reward us and give us something really pleasant and fun to work with if we will only pay attention to it.
Right.
And the tragedy, I think, for most of us is that we usually, because it's fun and because it's lighthearted, we don't pay attention to it. And so then we wait until there's a conflict or there's some dilemma going on in our lives, and then the dreams start, by the way, very gently. They start gently trying to nudge us, say, hey, you need to look at this. And we don't pay attention to it, and so then they try a little harder, and then pretty soon they're pounding pretty hard.
Mm-hmm.
And ultimately, this does express itself in crisis. And whether it's a medical crisis or whether it's a legal crisis or whether it's a loss of a loved one or whatever, it isn't playing around. It really wants us to listen.
Mm-hmm.
And if we don't get the message when it comes gently, then it's going to start pounding pretty hard.
Isn't that the truth?
I'm afraid it is.
Now, when it comes to an interesting word that for some reason is coming up for me now is kismet. And, we know that to be, like chance, for instance, things like that. Now, in dreams, is it that, or as you were just saying, it seems to come in subtly and consistently? It doesn't just come out of left field. It was something that you're kind of sending that energy, that psychic energy, whatever you want to call it, out there. It's trying to answer you now, and it's getting louder and louder. It isn't just chance, but it's really something that maybe we sent out there but then probably forgot about. Does that make sense?
Oh, sure. And we're sending it out all the time.
Mm-hmm.
One of my friends likes to say, dreams are your own State of the Union message.
Ah.
And so what they are doing is they are reflecting who you are in any given moment. Now, we all know that we struggle with issues sometimes, and we get a little piece of the answer to a puzzle, but the rest of the puzzle is still unsolved. And every once in a while, we'll get a major piece, maybe a whole section of a puzzle fits into place right away. Well, that's going to express itself in a pretty powerful way. And that's when we notice things like kismet. Wow, that guy or that teacher or that lover or that friend or that job opening came into my life. It just seemed like it came certainly out of the blue, but it seemed like it was from on high. It was just so perfect for me. It was so wonderful that it just everything fell into place. It was almost like magic.
Mm-hmm.
And that's, of course, what we refer to as kismet. Well, if you could go back and trace what had been going on up to that time, let's use an example. Let's use the example of the perfect employment that came along. And probably if it feels like kismet, it's followed a long search in which there was a lot of dead ends and a lot of maybe some job offers that were really not right. And it just seemed to get more and more depressing the more the job seeker kept looking for this. Usually what happens is it pulls you down first to the point where you let go in your own attitudes. You let go of something that you thought was really vital, which in fact you had outgrown. Like, oh, well, this job has to be such and such and such and such. And finally you say, well, I don't care. Those things don't matter to me anymore. Just get me some job that would be half reasonable. And all of a sudden the perfect thing comes along. And it's because you let go of the thing that you were putting up in the way. It was your own wall that you were putting up that was really inhibiting you in the direction that you yourself needed to go. So the minute you said, "Well, I just don't care anymore. This has been just such a hassle. Just anything will do." Well, all of a sudden you've released all of those little control mechanisms you had going on, and bingo, it could put in front of you the very thing that you needed. And the thing that's so wonderful about that, it's the reward of your own work. It's the reward of your having let go of something that just seemed important to you, but clearly was not important to you anymore.
Mm-hmm. It's also fascinating. I bet sometimes you have people that look at this at first with a bit of skepticism, but as it seeps in, they kind of look at it and go, wow, I never realized that Well, not to put an ego thing into it, but that I was that powerful and that empowered in my life.
Well, there is certainly that element, except that what usually comes along with it is this understanding that if you don't pay attention to it, they're really going to brain you. And so any sense of arrogance or, oh my goodness, I'm special, is humbled really fast.
Oh yeah.
But what you do is, what happens is there is this wonderful degree of surrender that comes. Mm-hmm. And that's all that's being asked of us anyway. And it's not surrender because, something out there is going to pull a power trip on us, although in its own way it does pull a power trip on us. It's surrender in the sense that there's something out there that can see wider and deeper and higher than we can from our own eyes. And that something, whatever it is out there, has our very, very best interests at heart. And what all it's trying to do is to get ourselves out of the way. And it's doing it through this constant dialogue. I'm sure that those of us who grew up going to church, oh Lord, hear our prayers. Well, if there was ever anything ridiculous that was ever said under any orthodox circumstances, it's that. There is never a moment when the Lord does not hear our prayers, and not only hears them, but is constantly responding and reacting to them 24/7. There's never a moment. That's why my book is called Always Dreaming. Mm-hmm. There is never a moment in our lives when this dialogue isn't going on. It's just that we have not learned to pay attention to it.
Mm-hmm. And it's about time that we did. I know with many spiritual people that I've talked with over the years, they say the same thing, that you're always heard and you're always answered. But the problem is that we either don't like the answer, we don't think it fits, or we really don't have any clarity as to what that answer is. We're not awake, so to speak.
I would absolutely agree with that 100%. And it's one thing when the answer comes to us as a direct answer, which it can do. But for every one of those experiences, there are thousands that we have in every given moment that are speaking this language of metaphor. Why should God learn Swahili and then learn, Japanese and then learn, a Cockney and then learn German? And, of course, God does know all those languages. But why make everything into a cubicle, put everything into a compartment, when in fact there is this one language that all of humanity shares, and that is the language of metaphor. You go to any culture, you go to any art field, in any nationality, in any race, in any language, in any place on the planet, and the one commonality you will find is that people express themselves through imagery. Mm-hmm. And that's what this is all about. And one of the reasons why we express ourselves through imagery is because that is the universal language. Mm-hmm. Imagery is the universal language that is expressed throughout all of life. And so it's not a surprise that, first of all, it comes from the universe, and second of all, that anywhere, no matter who you are, you could speak this language of metaphors. In any culture, no matter how little you knew of the spoken language, you could communicate with each other through metaphor. And it's no different with God. We communicate, God communicates to us and through us through the use of metaphor. And then we turn around and if we're smart, we communicate right back the same way.
There you go for the listeners out there. Pay attention and you'll have the life that you want, but you have to be willing to stretch out. And again, as you were saying, imagination and metaphors certainly need to be understood, that's for sure. The book is Always Dreaming. It's interpreting waking dreams. Our guest joining us on the Beyond 50 radio program today, David Rivenes. David, give out a website for our listeners out there where they can discover more.
Sure. My website is Teacher of Dreams, all one word, teacherofdreams.com, very simple. And then also the publisher of the book is Ozark Mountain Publishing, and they have their own website as well. You can also get the book on Amazon if you're interested. And if you're interested in talking to me, then the best place to go is to my own website, teacherofdreams.com.
Very good, and I can say to the listeners out there, David, I've talked with a lot of people over the years about dreams and dream interpretations, and there are books out there, and this should be a bestseller, bar none. I mean, it's probably the single best book that I've read on the topic where people can grapple a little bit better with what all this is about.
Well, thank you for that. That made my day. I certainly tried. I certainly tried to make this accessible and understandable. There are lots and lots of case histories and examples in there, and each one goes through its own sense of struggle as each individual. And so if you have struggles, you can identify with at least one and probably several of the dreamers in the book as they start with confusion and perplexity and then reach a solution and enlightenment.
Very much so. David, I want to thank you again for joining us here on the program today. I know this is going to open up a lot of eyes and hearts. There's no doubt about that. And for that website, go ahead and give that out one more time.
www.teacherofdreams.com.
David Rivenis, thank you for joining us here on the Beyond 50 radio program.
Thanks for having me, Daniel. I really appreciate it.
You bet. We want to thank you, the listeners out there. Another place you can dream yourself into existence is our website at beyond50radio.com. That is the number 50. Sign up for our free weekly e-news update. Stay up to date on what's going on out there in the world. I'm Daniel Davis. Thank you for tuning in. This is the Beyond 50 radio program. And remember, live your day past halfway.